Okay, so welcome to Wine and Wisdom for this week, Parshat Emor. We always begin by raising a glass of wine, whiskey, tequila, whatever you'd like. If you are drinking wine or grape juice, please join me in making a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. L'chaim, l'chaim. As we mentioned, there's the state of the union, and then there's the state of the universe. And that's this evening's class is going to be about the state of the universe. So for all those that are struggling between the television and this, turn the television off. This is much more important. The title of this evening's class, which by the way is available to be sponsored, if anybody would like to do that, now's a great time. You can type that in the chat or shoot me a text message, $54. And this class is sponsored either in honor or in memory of someone. You let me know. The title of this evening's class is Shabbat, a day of rest, reimagining the essence of Shabbat. As always, we get started always with a Parsha overview. And Arnold, can I ask you to read that for us, please?
Absolutely.
Overview of this week, Parshat Emor.
Okay. The Torah section of Emor begins with the special laws pertaining to the Kohanim, the priests. The Kohanim Gadol, which is the high priest, and the temple service. A Kohen may not become ritually impure through contact with a dead body, save on the occasion of the death of a close relative. A Kohen may not marry a divorcee or a woman with a promiscuous past. A Kohen Gadol can marry only a virgin. A Kohen with a physical deformity cannot serve in the holy temple, nor can a deformed animal be brought in as an offering. A newborn calf, lamb, or kid must be left with its mother for several days before being eligible to be offered for an offering. One may not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. The second part of the Emor lists the animals calling out of the annual calling out of holiness, the festivals of the Jewish calendar, the weekly Shabbat, the bringing of the Passover offering on the 14th of Nisan, the 7-day Passover festival beginning on the 15th of Nisan, the bringing of the Omer offering from the first barley harvest on the 2nd day of Passover, and the commencement on that day of the 49-day counting of the Omer, culminating in the festival of Shavuot on the 50th day. A remembrance of shofar blowing on the 1st of Tishrei, a solemn fast day on the 10th of Tishrei, the Sabbath festival, during which we are to dwell in huts for 7 days and take the four kinds. Reading in Hebrew. 4 kinds beginning on the 15th Tishrei and immediately following the holiday of the 8th day of Sukkot, Shemoni Atzeret. Next, the Torah discusses the lighting of the menorah in the temple and the showbread, Kohanim, Lechem Hakanim, placed weekly on the table. There, Emor concludes with the incident of a man executed for blasphemy and the penalty for the murder, that is the death, and for injury, injuring one's fellow on or destroying his property, monetary compensation. Okay.
Thank you, Yosef Ilan.
Okay.
So this is a brief overview of this week's Parsha. And by the way, this week's Parsha is also probably the most read Parsha in the Torah, I would imagine. I mean, I've never measured them all up against each other, but this week's Parsha is obviously we read it for Parshat Emor. But then in addition to that, we come back to it on each of these holidays. We read different sections of it on these holidays. I don't know if it's the most read, but certainly close to it. Maybe the one with the Parshat HaNasim is read more often because it's read the entire Hanukkah. Anyways, so as was mentioned, one of the things touched upon in the sixth Parsha is Shabbat. And that brings us to the topic of today's lesson. Again, is Shabbat a day of rest? Let's reimagine the essence of Shabbat. Okay? So, every once in a while, we encounter something that we kind of do over and over, or we say it over and over, and we hear it from other people, and we just assume it to be true, but we never really take a moment to think about it and to really properly understand what we're saying. I think one of those examples is Shabbat. I'm aware that on this Zoom, we have people of all levels of observance, but I think I'm going to assume that Shabbat is something we all grew up with. We knew about Shabbat from a very young age. And, when asked, why do we celebrate Shabbat? Anybody? Marilyn, why do we celebrate Shabbat?
Because God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. On the seventh day, he rested.
Very good. And we say it over and over again. God rested on Shabbat, therefore we rest on Shabbat. God rested on Shabbat, therefore we rested on Shabbat. Tonight's class is going to pick apart that sentence. God created the world in 6 days and rested on Shabbat, and therefore we rest on Shabbat. What's going on over here? First of all, let's talk about our rest on Shabbat. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking about your Shabbos nap, okay, but actually the Shabbos nap is the only thing we do on Shabbat, which is not mandated by it's mentioned in Shulchan Aruch, but it's not mandated by Shulchan Aruch, okay? What is mandated by Shulchan Aruch? You live 2 miles away from shul, no problem, you walk to shul. You get out of your bed and you walk to shul, 2 miles. Not so much rest for the weary. You get to shul, how long is davening? Twice or 3 times as long as a regular day, right? So you spend a lot of time davening, and davening can be work, especially if done properly. Davening is work. All right, then later on you're sitting at the Kiddush. Okay, that's a little enjoyable, but even so, by the way, the fact that there's a mandated meal, you got to do. This doesn't remind me much of when I truly rest. You know what I mean? Gitti and I decide life is becoming too much, so we're going to Hawaii for a week. I promise you, we don't spend 2 miles. We don't walk 2 miles to the nearest beach, like to go relax. We try to find the nearest place possible when we get out of bed. You know what I mean? Like eventually you get out of bed. Meaning rest is rest. Shabbos doesn't seem like a day of rest. That's number one. Number two, and perhaps an even more fundamental question. Marilyn said it, and everybody nodded their heads and said, "Yeah, God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested." Pray tell, He rested from what? What does it mean that God rested? He rested from creating the world. So creating the world was like a big deal for God?
No.
And He needed to rest? He was tired?
Nope.
What happened to the whole omnipotent, omniscient,
Exactly.
Everything. I mean, God is the all-doing, all-knowing, all-powerful. And all of a sudden, boom, 6 days, He's got to have rest. You know what I mean? So...
The funny thing is that it took Him a whole day to create, rather than doing it as instantaneously.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that could also be a good question. That's part of this. But all right. In addition to that, let's add another thing. Okay, let's add another. Hold on. Oh boy, I just looked at my phone for my text messages, and I have a text message from 3 people that they're going to be sponsoring tonight's class. I should do this more often. So you guys want to?
It says jointly.
No. Kalman offered to sponsor the class.
Oh, okay.
And then Phil and Sonia and Arnold offered to jointly sponsor the class. So why don't we do it this way? Phil and Sonia and Arnold will ask you to sponsor next week's class.
All right.
Just like that, I secured that they're going to be here next week. You're not going to miss the class you sponsor, right? And Kalman will accept your sponsorship for this week. Does that make sense? I'm just going based on the order of how I received the text message.
That's perfect.
This is there's no nepotism here. But okay. I do appreciate that everybody appreciates the class well enough that when they hear it's not sponsored, they volunteer. So thank you very much. So next week we have a sponsor already. Don't all jump at once. All right. Okay. I wanted to move on to saying there's another name for Shabbat. Another name for Shabbat is called Shabbat Kodesh. Anybody ever hear that term? Right? Oh, yeah. Shabbat. In fact, if you've been to a Jewish preschool, you'll know the song Shabbat Shabbat Yom Menucha Shabbat Shabbat Kodesh. Right? Shabbat Kodesh means the holy day of Shabbat. Right? And the holy day of Shabbat means that it's a day that somehow is holy. Hold on a second. Let's say we even figure out somehow that the things that we do on Shabbat are indeed rest. Resting and holy seem to be opposites.
Yeah.
Am I wrong here? Resting means I kick it back, I enjoy life. I take a break from life. Holy means I'm going to actively make sure that I'm doing holy things. I mean, Yom Kippur doesn't exactly seem like a day of rest to me. You know what I mean? That's like the holiest day of the year. You know what I mean? Imagine we said every Shabbat, in order for you to rest, you're going to fast the entire 24 hours.
Well, holiness means separation. Holiness means separation, and that often takes a lot of work.
Holiness
doing things
does mean
differently.
separation. Holiness means removing ourselves from the physical and connecting to the spiritual 100%. And that, yeah, like you said, it would seem to take a lot of work. And by the way, once we're at challenging notions that we've grown up with, what exactly does it mean that Shabbat is holy? What makes a day holy and what makes Shabbat holy? Okay, so the last question, let's start with that one, right? Because we'll work our way backwards slowly. The last question is an interesting one because your natural answer, what makes anything holy? Anybody? Ron, what makes something holy?
Are you there, Ron?
We cannot hear you. Ron? For some reason, we can't hear you. Kalman, what would you say? What makes something holy? Kodesh. Got nothing?
I would say the infusion of some godliness.
Okay. Can I simplify that for you? If God says something is holy, then it's holy, right? Right? But let's take a look. Go ahead, Phil.
Oh, how about sanctifying God?
Oh, you're saying when we sanctify God on a day, that makes the day holy?
I didn't think it through that far, but yeah.
Okay. Let's take a look at something here for a second, okay? Text 1 is from Bereshit, which we also mentioned, by the way, in the Kiddush. This is after God finishes creating the world. Phil, can you read this for us, please?
As soon as I move the photos here. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, for on it he rested from all his work.
For 1 second. God, why did God bless the seventh day? Why did he make it holy? He made it holy because it's a day of rest. Now I'm scratching my head. He sanctified it because he rested from all of his work. So because he rested, therefore it's kadosh, therefore it's holy. So I think it's time for us to dig a little deeper beneath the surface to understand a little bit more about what Shabbat is. Let's start with Rashi, and then we'll kind of summarize our questions here. Sonia, can you read for us, please?
What was the world lacking? Rest. Along came Shabbat. Along came rest. With this, the work of creation was completed.
This is the most interesting statement of all. Hold on a second. So God created for 6 days in a row. He created. He finished creating, but the world wasn't complete. Then he stopped creating, and when he stopped creating, ironically, his work was complete. What was missing was for him to stop working, and with this, his work was complete. That was the last bit of work he did, was not working. It was like an active rest. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So let's summarize our questions. Really, they're all going to boil down to one thing, which is what is the essence of Shabbat? What is Shabbat all about? Clearly, when we just say God worked for 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested, we're not really doing the topic entirely justice. And just to get a little nitty gritty here, what is God resting from? I thought he never gets tired. And how does resting on Shabbat make it holy, the world complete? What exactly is holy, and how do we make the world holy by resting on Shabbat? Okay. Everybody with me so far?
Yep, I am.
Okay. So over the next, I'd say 10, 15 minutes, we're going to get a little bit philosophical. We're going to get a little bit mystical, I would say. And please bear with me because it's worth it. What we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how God created the world in general. And then we'll finally understand what exactly it means to rest from creating the world. Sounds like a plan? Mm-hmm. Okay. When God created the world, God used the power of speech. We're familiar with that, right? It says, Vayomer Hashem Yehi Or, Vayehi Or. That God said, let there be light, and then there was light. God said, let the earth spread forth vegetation, and it did. There's a pasuk, I believe it's in, I won't say where because I'm not entirely sure. It says, La'olam Hashem Dvar Chanitza B'Shamayim, that forever, God, your words stand in the heaven. Says the Baal Shem Tov, you know what's going on here? Those words of creation are forever standing in the heaven, and they are what support the world. So at every single moment when God created the world, and then when he recreates the world, at every single moment since then, because if God wanted that the world shouldn't exist, poof, the world just wouldn't exist. All he needs to do is stop willing it into existence, and it would stop existing. So ever since that day, that fateful day when God created the world continues to exist because God continues to animate it, continues to pulsate light and energy into the world to recreate it. And that takes the form of these different Hebrew letters and Hebrew words, what Pirkei Avot calls the Aseret HaMamarot, the 10 utterances, what Hasidus would just call the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, rearranged in different ways. In fact, this is really tangential a little bit, but when Adam named the animals, it says that the angels finally understood why God called him, what was so special about the human being. That God brought a shor, he brought an ox in front of Adam, and Adam said, this should be a shor, this should be an ox. And they were impressed. They were impressed by his work. And Hasidus explains why they were impressed. You see, because he didn't just pull a name out of his hat, you know what I mean? He could have called it, wine. That would have been the name of an ox in Hebrew. It would have been called wine. You know what I mean? Or whatever, or any word for that matter, right? What is language? Language is just at least most languages, besides for Lashon HaKodesh, most languages are just, they're an agreement between men that this is what we're going to call this item, and this is how we're going to say this, and this is how we're going to say that. When God created the world, there was not just letters, not just words that were animating the world, but also a godly energy that was pulsating through those letters and through those words that was creating the world. So when Adam looked at an ox, for example, he saw 3 types of energy: a shin, a vav, and a resh. And he said, oh, if so, and he saw the order of the energy and exactly how it worked itself out, and therefore he called it a shor. Okay. Now, the problem is that godly energy, if we just keep it as simple as that, just God pulsating light and animating the world, you got yourself a problem. Imagine trying to take a cup and putting it under Niagara Falls and trying to get a glass of water. Right? You would quickly lose your cup. Not just lose it, but it would only shred to pieces. Never mind, I'm not sure exactly what happened to your hand. The immense power and energy of godliness pulsating into the world should not only not create us, or not only not create the world, but should really burst the world and not allow the world to even exist. In the face of such great light, how could anything exist? Right? Imagine taking a candle or a flame on anything and bringing it up close to a bonfire, a Lag BaOmer bonfire. You know what I mean? That was a great time to plug tomorrow evening at about 7 o'clock. We're having a Lag BaOmer bonfire and drum circle and all sorts of exciting stuff with s'mores, etc. Please join us at 7 o'clock in the evening tomorrow. Maybe earlier. I think it might be 6:30 tomorrow evening here in the parking lot of Chabad. In any event, so enter a Kabbalistic concept called the Tzimtzum. Raise of hand. Anybody ever hear of the Tzimtzum? All right, okay. We got quite a number of advanced students here. The Tzimtzum is when God did, he concealed himself to a degree. In other words, he filtered himself. Imagine yourself looking into the face of the sun, and you have to put on a pair of sunglasses in order to filter the sunlight before it comes into your eyes. Just looking at the sun, you want to be able to see anything. So God had to filter his energy. Baron, can you read for us? Text 3 is from the Alter of Ben Tanya, not the first part of Tanya, which is more psychological in nature, or emotional in nature, or what have you, but the second section of Tanya, Shara Yichud V'Amuna, which is much more philosophical in nature, the Alter Rebbe explains how this works. Go ahead.
God's power of restraint is the quality of zitzim, concealment, whereby he withholds his great expansiveness and prevents it from descending and being revealed to created beings. Rather than animating all creation openly, he operates in concealment to create the impression that the created being exists independently from God, though the created being has no independent existence. Nevertheless, the restraining power of the omnipotent godly conceals the spiritual life force that flows from him so as not to nullify the existence of the created being.
Okay. This is the general idea of Tzimtzum. By the way, we experience Tzimtzum sometimes in our own lives. We do this, by the way. Imagine trying to explain to a young child. Hold on, we have a question here, I think. Oh, Ron, I'm not sure why we can't hear you. Okay, if you can hear us, then we're doing great. Imagine trying to explain to a young child, for instance, that 2 + 6 = 8, right? But instead of you starting off with the very, very simple, let's take 2 apples and 6 apples, or 2 fingers and 6 fingers and try to put them together, you inundate with information because 2 + 6 = 8, therefore 8 + this, and you build off all these other, you gotta really start very, very simple. But even starting with 2 + 6 = 8 is a little silly. Let's start first with 1 + 1 = 2. Let's get that to click by him, right? So even though you might have a lot of other information in your brain that you might want to give over to the child, but in order for him to properly understand what you're trying to communicate with him, you got to start with one simple thing, right? So Hashem used the Tzimtzum in order to allow us to, so to speak, experience creation. Now, I have a great idea. So God conceals himself. Maybe let's take this all the way to the extreme. God should conceal himself entirely, right? If God conceals himself entirely, then we would be able to come into full existence, right? No, wrong, because we have a problem. If God conceals himself entirely, then there's nothing animating us. There's nothing, remember, all we are is godliness. All we are is God, all this world is godly energy animating the world. So there's kind of this fine balance that God is always working. On the one hand, there's a godly energy that's animating the world, but it's not too much. It's filtered down into what's called a ha'ara, or a slight stream of energy, just enough to create the world, but not enough to combust it and cause it not to exist. Now, as a result, throughout the world, there are kind of gradations of Tzimtzum. For starters, in order to get, in order to get to this physical world, God first created other spiritual realms that you might be familiar with. Atzilot, Bria, Yetzira. Kabbalah talks about these things, right? Until it got down to this physical world. All of these things happen through God fluctuating between how much energy is coming down into the world and how much tzimtzum, or how much concealment, right, restraint of the energy is going on as he's created the world. Now, fascinatingly, we actually see this in the world around us. Right? Think about it. One of the greatest symptoms of life is movement, animation, right? And when we look around throughout the world, we find different levels of animation, and that is directly connected to how much of God's how much of God's animation energy, let's call it, is actually flowing, or is actually visible and tangible, etc. Marilyn, can you read for us text 4?
The diffusion of God's light, which is the life force of creation, is not equal in all created beings in the balance of its concealment and revelation. In physical and inanimate bodies, such as stones and soil, the light is most restricted. The life force is so minimal that it can't even grow. By contrast, the divine light in plant life is less restricted. Generally speaking, there are 4 categories: the inanimate, the botanical, the animal, and the human. The diffusion of divine light and life force in the inanimate and plant life can't be compared to the light and life force in the animal or in the human being.
So hold on a second. Let's go through this one step at a time. There are different gradations of tzimtzum. There are different levels of how much concealment or restraint God is practicing with the world. Let's start with a stone, right? I think definitely if anybody would look at a stone, they would say the stone is being created, right? The fact that there is a stone here, right? It means that it shows a sign that God created this stone, right? I don't know that anybody would say anything else more than that. Stones don't move on their own, right? Stones are inanimate objects, and similarly with anything else, earth or other inanimate objects as such. A level above, we immediately call them alive. We don't even call inanimate objects alive, even though to a certain degree they do have life, right? They get energy, otherwise they wouldn't even be in existence. But as we move on to the plant, right, to the plant realm with the vegetation, these categories in Hebrew are called domim, that's the inanimate objects. Someach are plant life. And plants, we already know there could be live trees, dead trees. I had a tree growing outside my house that was pushing down one of the walls, and the HOA came and they said they sent some professionals. I'm going to come take a look, and they said, "Oh, the tree is unhealthy and it's dying. That's why it was growing crooked, and there were different symptoms." So they got the tree down, right? What do you mean it's sick? It's a sick like a human being is sick. I didn't hear the tree cough. Yeah, but there are certain elements of life that the plant world or vegetation has. More than an inanimate object, right? So back to our original barometer, which is movement or animation, a stone doesn't grow, right? Plants do. They grow. They grow in different directions. They do different things. And they can even react to circumstances around them, right? Vines, for instance, grow along walls. Marilyn is shaking her head. I'm preaching to the choir. I'm not even preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to the conductor. She's the gardener. She should be telling us all about what plants do. In any event, but plants definitely contain more life and more animation than inanimate, right? Next level, of course, is animals. They have vitality. You know, they hunt, they move, they have lives of their own, etc. And of course, the highest level of all is the human beings. Human beings are what's called the medaber, right? These are collectively called domem, someach, chai, medaber, not collectively, I'm sorry, respectively. And each of these categories is a kind of another layer, another level, another infusion of life. Or another way of looking at it is that they have less tzimtzum. The more you go along, the less tzimtzum there is. Now back to our $1 million question. So what is Hashem resting on Shabbat? So here comes the answer. Kalman, can you read for us, please?
The concept of divine rest is to refrain from tzimtzum. As it is written, Elohim completed on the seventh day. Elohim is the name of God that represents God's capacity for restraint and concealment. And on Shabbat, the tzimtzum implied by the name Elohim expired, and God rested from the active tzimtzum. Something similar occurs every week on Shabbat. On this day, God rests from the active concealment, and the divine light is revealed without the veil of tzimtzum, making us aware that we are standing before the King.
Thank you. In the pasuk it says, "Vayechal Elokim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa." Okay, which means that God concluded. That's the normal translation of the word "vayechal." On the seventh day, God concluded all of the work that He meant to do. Says the Rebbe Rashab. Hold on a second. The Rebbe Rashab was the fifth Chabad Rebbe. He says, hold on a second. The word "vayechal," which usually means to complete, can also mean it expired, like kalot, like to finish off, to not be anymore. He says, why don't we translate this as Vayechal Elokim? The name Elokim expired. The name Elokim, of the two names of Hashem, is the name which is always consistently related to Tzimtzum. Whenever you see the name Elokim, in fact, nature, which is really the biggest Tzimtzum, right? The very fact that I was just discussing this with somebody today. I learned the Kuzari, which is a very philosophical work, with somebody on Wednesday afternoons. So we were just discussing the fact that nature is a very interesting concept, right? Because we look around the world, we see things happening, and we say, oh yeah, that's natural. That's nature. That's nature at work. Why is the river flowing? Why are people having children? Why is the sun rising? It's nature. That's the way nature works. And the Kuzari, the author of the Kuzari, points out a very interesting thing. He says, not only we call it nature, we found a word, we tacked it on, we use that word collectively for all rules that there are in the universe, but we're not even satisfied with that. We're not even satisfied with a word for the system of the universe. No. We, for some reason, consistently ascribe consciousness to that force. I guess in those times, the times of the Kuzari, they would call it active nature or wise nature. But I think a more modern equivalent is mother nature. Why aren't we satisfied by calling it nature? Why do we have to call it by some sort of mother nature, as if it's some sort of being? It's because nature itself, even though of course it's this word that we've ascribed to the whole system of the way the universe works, but nature itself cries out that there's something beyond it, a godly being that's kind of orchestrating it and planning it and moving it and changing it at all times. In any event, leaving that aside for a second, nature, the point that I'm trying to make is that nature is the greatest concealment, right? Nature is kind of that biggest symptom. God puts all of these rules and workings into effect, this whole system of the way the world works, and that conceals on the fact that God is making this happen, right? Even the sun rising in the morning, which, to be honest, is so mind-boggling. The sun comes up every morning. There's a system, how it works. We figured it out, and we say, all right, it's nature. All right, yeah, okay. Why don't we wake up every single morning when we see sunrise? We have to see a beautiful sunset to say, wow, look at what God can do. And on a rainy day, it's not, look at what God can do, beautiful how it is, right? We have to have a child is born and people say, oh, it's miraculous. And us breathing every day is not miraculous. They are, but it's natural and normal, and that's it. So we get used to it, right? Right. So nature actually has this, the word for nature, hateva, in Hebrew, actually has the same grammatical value, the same numerical or gematria value as the word Elohim, which is one of God's names. Everybody with me? So where are we getting here? Says the Rebbe Rashab that on the seventh day, God finished with the name of Elohim. He said to the name of Elohim, which essentially is basically one of God's ways of interacting with the world, which is through concealment. He says it's time to retire. It's time to retire the idea of restraint, and I need to show myself more. For 6 days, God was very busy, restraining his light in order to allow for our existence. On the seventh day, Vayachal Elokim b'yom hashvi. On the seventh day, God let go for a second. He said, now I will allow you to see beyond the veil. You know what I mean? It's like the Wizard of Oz saying, pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz, right? Look what's going on behind it. There is a God after all. There is a certain sanctity. And that automatically leads to a holiness. You can start to see some of the answers to the questions we brought at the beginning. We'll summarize them at the end, but you can start to see some of the answers. We're beginning to see what the holiness of Shabbat is. What is the holiness of Shabbat? Shabbat itself is a holier day because we are more in tune with God, because God's essence is more revealed. God is letting go of a certain barrier, a certain veil of concealment that there was between the world and Him, in order to allow us to see more of godliness in the world.
How does that manifest itself?
Well, very good. So we'll soon get to why that's necessary. But first, let's talk about how does that manifest itself. So first of all, obviously it manifests itself in the world, but let's start off by seeing how it manifests itself actually in us. Okay? Common, since you asked the question, you'll start by reading for us text 6. Go ahead. So this is from the Talmud and Tractate Tainit. The Talmud is trying to figure out what's going on Shabbat, at least in human beings. What's going on in human beings on Shabbat?
An additional measure of soul is given to us on Friday afternoon and is taken from us on Saturday night. This is derived from the verse, on the seventh day, Shabbat vayinafash, he rested and was refreshed. These Hebrew words form an abbreviation for Kivan Sheshavat Vai Avda Nefesh. Once Shabbat ends, woe, our additional soul is lost. Vai Nefesh is Vai Nefesh.
Kivan Sheshavat. I thought it was only Vai of the Nefesh.
Yeah, so Shabbat Vayinafash is after it, Shavat, then Vai Nefesh.
Right, exactly. The Kavan is a little, I'm not sure why they quoted that in the English. Either way, the last word over there, right, by Yom HaShvi Shavat Vayinafash, that on the seventh day God rested and he, I don't know, exhaled. How would you say Vayinafash? Another word for resting. Yeah, here they say, and he refreshed. He rested and was refreshed. The Hebrew word Vayinafash can also be read as Vai Nafash. Vai meaning woe, and Nafash meaning the soul. In other words, the Talmud is saying that at the moment that Shabbat ends, Vai Nafash, we say woe because we lose an additional soul that we have. On Shabbat, believe it or not, every single one of us is in tune with more of our soul than we are normally on a regular day. The more colloquial version you might be familiar with is that we actually receive an extra soul. More literally, I think this is an extra layer of our soul. For those of you that are familiar, the soul is split into five levels. Normally, we access two of them. Two of them are constantly up in heaven, still interacting with us, but up in heaven, still animating us, but up in heaven. And the third one is usually in heaven, comes down on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and enters our body, and therefore we are on a more spiritual plane when Shabbat comes. By the way, this comes out directly into halacha, even into halacha. Baron, if you can read for us text 7, this is literally just from Shulchan Aruch, from the Jewish Code of Law, as to one of the customs at Havdalah. Go ahead.
Our sages instituted the ritual of smelling spices at the end of Shabbat to revive the soul, which is melancholy at this time over the departure of the additional soul. We settle the soul and cheer it with a pleasing fragrance.
So, besamim, the concept of smelling spices on Saturday night is actually, believe it or not, a consolation for the soul in order to allow it to get over its loss of this extra layer of soul. So on this, come again?
It's like a refresher.
Like a refresher, I think it's more of a consolation. In other words, we lost a soul. The soul goes back up for the next 6 days, and therefore the part of our soul that is in our body is a little bit, melancholy. Use the word that they translate.
Yeah. Okay.
And therefore we say, all right, look, take it easy, relax. And that's why we smell. But by the way, this doesn't stay in the soul. This continues into the body. Arnold, can you read for us, please? Text 8.
A person's face is incomparable, more radiant on Shabbat than the rest of the week.
The Medrash tells us that a person's face is different on Shabbat than it is throughout the week. Now, this is some pretty heavy stuff. And Kalman, if you can read for us, please, because really in order to fully drive this home, I'd love to read from Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, otherwise known as the Rav. So this is from a biography of his. In any event, this is him speaking. Go ahead. Kalman.
In Warsaw, we lived 3 houses away from the Madrasa Shtibel. Generally, I would go to the Madrasa Shtibel for the Suda Shlishit, the third meal of the Shabbat. They would sing all the Zmirot for the Suda Shlishit. Poor Jews would be seated around the table in the Shtibel. I knew these Jews well, and I constantly spoke with them. They were sincerely pious Jews who willingly sacrificed for the spiritual commitments. I once spoke with one of them who was frail and short. He constantly carried heavy metal pieces, and I wondered where he got the physical strength to support this weight. His load is carrying metal on Shabbos?
No, this is during the week. You'll see.
Oh, okay, all right. He constantly carried heavy metal, and I wondered where he got the physical strength to support this weight. His load was always tied around him with a thick cord, and he totally resembled a coolie. What's that?
So I didn't know either. They have here, I Googled it. During the 19th and early 20th century, coolie was a term for an indentured servant, indentured to a company, mainly from South Asia or China. This is the word he used. Okay, go ahead.
On the Sabbath, I saw this very Jew, and I did not recognize him. He came over to me in his tattered kapata. It was covered with endless patches, and even the patches had patches. Yet his face shone with the joy of the Shabbat. I recognized in a tangible fashion that a person's Shabbat countenance is totally different than his weekday appearance.
And this, by the way, is a simple Jew. This is a simple laborer. This is not some fancy holy rabbi that he shared. Oh, I met this rabbi, and you should have seen his face on Shabbat. I'm happy to share with you stories from rabbis too. One of them in particular comes to mind, which I'll share in a moment. But the idea is, and we should be familiar with this as well, Jews enter a different state. I'll never forget, even as a child, walking to shul with my father, and on a good week, we'd be walking a little early, it wouldn't be Shabbos then, and Shabbos would come in to the world maybe 5 minutes on the way to shul or 3 minutes on the way to shul. And I could hear my father exhaling, going, Bas Shabbos, Bas Menucha. Shabbos is coming, and here comes rest. And his countenance would change. The way I interacted with him during the week and the way I interacted with him on Shabbat was different. And there's no question that every single one of us is like that. Now, part of it is probably can be attributed to the Erev Shabbos rush, which is another little thing that's not really spoken about from a spiritual perspective. The fact that somehow on a Friday, right before Shabbat comes, everybody's always rushing. You know, one of the things that I have recently is I turn on my phone after Shabbat, and when I turn it on, I inevitably have a text from the same fellow. It's like from 5 minutes before Shabbat, and my phone was off already. And he's like, "Wait, don't close the gate to the shul. I'm coming in." You know, like driving in. Leave it open. He doesn't have a clicker to the gate. In any event, but right, and this is part of the Erev Shabbos rush. It shouldn't be. We should hopefully take Shabbat a little bit early. But no matter what, Friday is rush. So it could be that also attributes to the change in demeanor. But there's also a spiritual side to it. I'll share a story of Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, famously known as the Ruzhiner. He was a Hasidic master. Anyways, he was a holy man, and the Talmud tells us that butzin mikafi yadiyah, that holy people. The Talmud is saying that onions, even when they're tiny, you could tell if it's going to be. Marilyn, maybe you can fill us in. I never checked this up from a gardening perspective, but that onions apparently, even when they're tiny, you can tell if it's going to be a good onion or not. Or squashes, I'm not sure. One of them, either onions or squashes, one of them. You can tell when they're tiny how they're going to be. So they use this term to refer to like heavy Torah scholars or heavy righteous and big tzaddikim. And when they were very, very young, you're also able to see these traits in them. So the Ruzhina, when he was very, very young, his teacher was teaching, right? His name was Yisrael of Ruzhin. His teacher was teaching them the laws of Shabbat, and he's teaching them that when a person, what happens if a person loses track of Shabbat? Kalman, you've heard this before? I see you nodding your head.
No, but you just remind me of the Reimagining.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So I brought a smile to your face. All right. Yeah. So Yisrael of Ruzhin is sitting, and his teacher is teaching him, and he says, if somebody loses track of Shabbat, X, Y, and Z, this is the process that we follow. And he's very, very disturbed. He doesn't get it. He says, how do you lose track of Shabbat? So his teacher starts giving him examples, and maybe you're wandering alone in the desert, or you're lost in the forest, etc. He says, I don't get it. Why would it make a difference? You can always just look up at the heavens and see if it's Shabbat or it's not Shabbat in the world. Obviously, this was no regular child. And later in life, the Ruzhiner was known to be able to just sense when Shabbat came in. One of the famous stories they tell about him, and actually we get this story from Rabbi Isaac of Hummel, that he was once with him, and he was watching the Ruzhiner had a pipe, and he was smoking his pipe right before Shabbat. And at a certain point, there was no clock in the room, at a certain point he took the pipe out of his mouth, put it out, and his whole demeanor changed. And this is because he sensed that Shabbat entered the world. In any event, but back to us practical people for a second, right? Not tzaddikim. I mean, maybe there's some of you here that are tzaddikim, and I shouldn't speak for everybody, but at least for me, text 10a is actually another interesting law about how this affects literally the way we act, based on the fact that that Shabbat changes the world. Sonia, can you read text 10a for us, please?
Sure. We chant the blessings of the bridegroom in the presence of 10 men for 7 days. Rabbi Yehuda said, only if a new face arrives.
Only if a new face arrives. So some of you might be familiar with this custom. Hold on, Sonia, you're going to finish the whole picture for us in just a minute. So some of you might be familiar with this custom, which is that for 7 days, Sheva Brachot are recited, right? 7 special blessings are recited for 7 days after the marriage of a bride and groom. Okay. So do we say Sheva Brachot every single day? The answer is there's a small caveat. There has to be a new person each day. So on the first day following the marriage, there has to be somebody there that was not present at the wedding. On the second day following the marriage, there has to be somebody who wasn't there yesterday and wasn't there at the wedding. Right? Every day there has to be a brand new person. Otherwise, you cannot make Sheva Brachot. Why? Because there's a certain simcha, there's a certain joy that a new face brings. We all know this, right? You guys are all sick of. You see me every single week, every Wednesday on Zoom. You're all sick of me. You don't make any special brachot for seeing me. But if you hadn't seen me in 3 years, even if you never got along with me, right? You don't see me in 3 years. Zushi, so nice to see you. 3 days later, you're sick of me again, right? Anybody relates with this concept? Okay, don't admit it here publicly that you're sick of me. All right, fine, no problem. Anyways, so here's the question. What if not what's if. What's about the one day of the Shabbat brachot when there is no panim chadashot? So we have an interesting fact. Go ahead, Sanya.
Shabbat is also considered a new face.
So if the wedding is on a Tuesday, Wednesday you need a new face in order to do Shabbat brachot. Thursday you need a new face. Friday you need a new face. Friday night, Shabbos, no. Shabbos itself is the new face. Shabbos is the guest that we haven't seen all week, and now it's here. Very, very interesting. What exactly is going on over here? So the Rebbe explains. Sanya, text 10c.
On Shabbat, there is no need for a new face, for a Jew's face is incomparably more radiant on Shabbat than during the week. Our radiance renews on Shabbat and confers upon us the status of a, quote, new face. That's interesting.
Very, very interesting. So a Jew could have been present. In other words, I could have been yesterday at the meal, right? But today, that's not the case anymore. I'm not the same person that I was yesterday, and therefore I'm considered a new face for today. Very, very interesting. So we have two aspects of halacha, of literally day-to-day life that change based on the fact that we change and the world changes around us on Shabbat. On a spiritual level, our soul is different, right? That's why we have the feeling of melancholy at the end of Shabbat as that extra soul leaves. And on a physical level, our face shines differently. It even affects us on a physical level that we feel differently, and that's why we can say the blessings for a bridegroom, because it's a new face. And that's all a result of the fact. Where do all these changes to the world come from? As we mentioned earlier, hopefully you were with me when we were at the Kabbalistic part, because Hashem rests every single Shabbat, just as He rested on the first Shabbat of the world. Hold on, what's this? Oh yeah, hold on, we'll get to this. Just as on the first Shabbat of creation, God rested from tzimtzum. He rested from restraint. He rested from concealing Himself, which was how He created the world. And what did He do? He said, you know what? I can't just conceal and conceal and conceal. I got to give them a chance to breathe. Give them a chance to see my countenance. And then we can go back to the regular 6 days of concealment. Similar to that, every single week, this happens again. Hashem says, let me lift this a little bit. Let me make this day holier by resting, right? Hashem rests. So remember our question about the words of Kiddush? Hashem says, yes, I rest on every seventh day, just as I rested on the first seventh day. Therefore, Shabbat becomes holier. Because I'm resting from Tzimtzum, because I'm resting from the concealment of Shabbat, therefore Shabbat becomes a holier day. Now, here's the question. So how should this affect our approach to Shabbat? Right? So we already mentioned that there are these halachic rulings about Shabbat. You know, if you have Shabbat brachot on Shabbat, you don't have Shabbat on Shabbat, Havdalah, things like that. But how should me, Zushi Rifkin, how should we, every one of us here on the Zoom, how should we approach Shabbat? What should our day be filled with if we're trying to reflect this reality that Hashem is resting from Tzimtzum and more in tune with the world? So the Rebbe has some advice for us. Baron, can you read for us, please?
These are the two poles that are expected of a Jew. During the 6 days when the Torah mandates that we concern ourselves with our material body, working is a mitzvah. Nevertheless, on Shabbat and Jewish holidays, when the soul is more radiant, we must transcend our body, its concerns, and its nature. It is self-understood that work is out of the question during these days.
So here's the question. Not his question. Here's the goal. The goal is to find a certain kind of balance, a certain symbiosis, that we should work for 6 days. That's the purpose of the world. Nobody's saying the 6 days of creation, the 6 days of the week are bad. No. God conceals Himself, and it's our job to fix the world. The world is broken. Tikkun olam. We're out there. We're fixing. We're doing. But our souls, and really our bodies as well, every once in a while need to recharge. Comes Shabbat, and on Shabbat we are supposed to rest. Of course we don't work, we don't do forbidden work, but the point is that we don't just rest, but we get in tune with God's resting, in other words, with the extra revelation of godliness that there is here in the world. So that is the goal of what we're supposed to be doing on Shabbat. Very interesting. So this reframes what is work and what is resting. So what should we do? Go kick back on the beach? That's how we're going to get in tune with godliness? Of course not. Right? Of course we're going to go to shul. Of course we're going to daven. Of course we're going to sit at a farbrengen, at a kiddush, etc., and become closer. That's the whole purpose. We have to do things in order to get more in tune with godliness. And nobody's saying that's not work, by the way. That might be work. Not a doubt that might be. That is work. Meditative prayer is work, right? Learning Torah and actually becoming close with Hashem, getting in tune with our neshama is work. But it's a very, very different type of work. In the words of the Rebbe. Marilyn, can you read for us, please?
Resting on Shabbat doesn't mean the absence of work. Not only do we work to serve God on Shabbat, but our work is also of a higher order. We must therefore conclude that resting on Shabbat means to work in a manner that is restful and delightful. That is to say, it is not considered laborious at all because it is a pleasure to engage in such work. A simple example, if we were given permission to gather as many gems and diamonds as we could spare no effort in carrying the heaviest load that we could possibly lift. Though this would entail strain, toil, and perspiration, it would not be considered strenuous or burdensome. On the contrary, the heavier load, the more delighted we would be.
Imagine at the beginning of the class, thank you, Marilyn, that we were just up in Reno collecting snow, etc., right? And I remember talking to some of the other guys and saying, you know, if these sacks were full of dirt, I don't know if it would be as easy for me to do it. Right? Carrying sacks of diamonds for some reason is much lighter than carrying sacks of dirt, right? And to us, it was such a labor of love that we were gathering the snow for the mikveh and all that. It was like such a wonderful experience. Don't get me wrong, my back was sore for a couple of days afterwards. But the idea that to us, it wasn't schlepping a 30, 40, 50-pound bag, depending on some of those bags were very, very heavy. It was like, this was exciting. I mean, can you imagine this is like a 3-year process coming to fruition? The mikveh is coming to its conclusion. It's very exciting. And a big thank you, by the way, to all those that showed up at 11 o'clock at night to help with the schlepping of the snow off of the truck, to put it in the mikveh. It was an amazing moment of community. On Shabbat, we are allowed to work, but we're only allowed to work restful work. Does that make sense? We are allowed to actively rest. Just as Hashem actively rested on the 7th day, what did he do? He stopped with the tzimtzum, but he actively created rest in the world. He actively brought an extra holiness into the world. Similarly, we too, on the 7th day, with what should we be preoccupied? We should be preoccupied with tuning into that spirituality and to that kedusha. And this really brings us to all of the answers to the questions that we had at the beginning of the class. Shabbos is not a day of rest in the sense that we simply relax. It is a time to engage in a higher form of work, a spiritual toil that is truly delightful, that is restful for the soul. So let's recap here for a second the 4 questions that we had at the beginning of the class. Question number 1 is, how is it resting if you're walking 2 miles to shul and then davening for 3-4 hours, etc.? This becomes very, very clear. Are you kidding me? That's what Shabbat is all about. Getting in tune with that eternal rest, the holiness of Shabbat. How did Hashem rest? That was very clear. We answered that Hashem rested from tzimtzum. He rested from concealment, right? And how does that make the day holy? Because automatically, if Hashem is resting from tzimtzum, the day becomes holier because there's more revelation of godliness. And that's why it says in the pasuk, "Vayevarech Elokim et Yom HaShvi vayikadesh otam," that Hashem made the day holy. How? Kivo Shabbat B'Gamalachte. By resting, that's how he made it holy, because that's indeed what happened. And that should be reflective in our take on Shabbat as well. I'll end off with 2 stories. Okay, one of which I shared this past week at the sermon in shul, but I think only one of you was there. So Ron, you'll have to excuse me. Maybe Baron, maybe you were there as well. Yeah. If you remember from the sermon, you'll hear it again. And I'll end off with 2 stories. One story is a very short story from a man whose name is Sammy Rohr. For those of you that are familiar, at the end of the class each week, there's this little logo, right? It's called the JLI, the Jewish Learning Institute, and that's the organization that puts together this curriculum that we use. It is otherwise known as the Roar Jewish Learning Institute because of a, Ron can tell us all about him, right? Ron, this is your uncle. What's his name? He's muted. He can't even talk. I can say whatever I want now if I want. Anyway, no, not related to Ron, but a different man by the name of George Rohr, whose father was Sammy Rohr. And anyway, Sammy Rohr was a Holocaust survivor, and he lived in Basel, Switzerland. And the local rabbi there, Rabbi Dov Yehuda Shachat, who was the rabbi of the religious community there, he invited him once to a Shabbos class, a Shabbos morning class, 7 a.m. to come and learn Tehillim before davening. And Sammy looked at him and he said, I don't understand. I have one day out of the week that I could sleep in, and you're asking me to come and learn? The rabbi, quick on his feet, looked at him and said, I don't understand. You have one day out of the week that you can get up early and learn, and you're going to sleep? Needless to say, the rabbi won. And I think the perspective here is so powerful. In other words, is Shabbos a day that you take a 15-hour nap? No way, right? Like, of course it's not. You want to take a little nap like that, you're more rested, etc. Like that, you should be able to daven and learn, etc. Sure, no problem. But it's not a day of sleep. It's a day of rest. It's a day of reconnecting with God through Torah and Mitzvah. The other story that I want to end off with is very, very personal. My father tells a story that when he was 25 years old, newly married, he used to go upstates to the Catskills, right, to the Borscht Belt.
Right.
A colony that was called, you remember this story, Baron, from Shabbos? So a colony, so you'll tell me if I said it right. To a colony that was, that's what happens when it talks about Shabbos and the Parsha 2 weeks in a row. Last week it said at Shabbat Tishmoru, and this week it also talks about Shabbat again. And anyway, so they used to go to a colony that was called Gersons. Anyways, so there, it was like a bungalow colony with all these little, bungalows, etc. And there was a shul there, but it was like a more, like a shul in the mountains. So the doors were like these swinging screen doors. And he was very young, and him and his friend would stand outside during davening, and they would schmooze. And then when they would hear that it was Baruch Hu, they would come in, and let the door slam behind them, and hear Baruch Hu, and then they'd go out, and then come back in, and go out and come back in, whatever. And then they would rip off a davening in 10, 15 minutes. They would read all the Hebrew words, and that's it. For whatever reason, their davening wasn't properly gedavened. Right inside the shul, right next to the screen door that kept slamming every time they would come walking in and out, was an elderly chassid. His name was Peretz Muchkin. And he was sitting there with his talis over his head since 6 o'clock in the morning trying to daven. He was sitting for hours davening. And every time the screen door would like slam, he would like look up, like, oh, whatever, okay, keep davening. So at the Kiddush, at the Fabrengen, he started to tell my father and his friend, the two guys particularly who I guess had disturbed him a little, he started to tell them off a little bit. He was one of the elderly ones in the community. At the Kiddush, there was a Fabrengen, and he was talking. And he was sharing that there's a pasuk in Parshat Mishpatim. It says, V'chiyirivun anashim. Two people will be fighting. And then it says, one will hit the other, v'nafal lemishkam, and he will fall down, laying down. He's like unconscious. The pasuk ends off, Rak shifto yitin v'rape yirape. There's 5 categories of different types of reimbursement that a person has to give to someone else if he damages them. What in legal terms is called torts, right? So shifto is unemployment. Rapo yirape means medical bills. And anyway, so he started to explain this pasuk a little different. He says, "V'chiyirivun anashim." People inside of them have a battle. The battle is constantly going on. There's a nefesh elokit, and there's a nefesh bahamit, there's a godly soul and an animal soul, and they're constantly fighting with each other. Every once in a while, the animal soul comes, it gives a big zetz to the godly soul, and the godly soul falls down and it seems unconscious. This happens to us every once in a while. This is the nature of the human being. We're always struggling, and we're not always winning. And every once in a while comes a moment when we really don't feel like we're winning, and everything seems dark. You're unconscious. Says the Torah, how do you get out of it? How do you snap out of it? Says the Torah, and he translates these words as follows. He says, Rak shifto yitein v'rapa yirape. Rak shifto, he says, you can read the word Shabbato. At least give yourself a Shabbat. I understand if the whole week you're so busy working and you're davening is 15 minutes, 20 minutes in the morning, maybe you do daven with a minyan, maybe you don't. Even if you daven with a minyan, maybe you come late, whatever it is, you need to leave early to go to shul, to go to work, whatever it is, right? I understand that the whole week. But Rak Shifto, why was Shabbat given? If you just take care of your Shabbat, if on Shabbat your davening is a proper davening, you actually focus and you meditate and you connect with God through your learning Torah, through your davening, then virapa yirape, then you can be healed, and the nefesh halokit, the godly soul, can pick itself back up and start all over again. So l'chaim, to recognizing that Shabbat is not just a day that's devoid of work. I love that line. They didn't do justice in the translation. Text 12. Hamenucha de Yom HaShabbat eina inyan shel heder havodah. Resting on Shabbat doesn't just mean the absence of work. Shabbat is not just a day that's devoid of work. Shabbat is a day, it's not just no work. So what do I do? Nothing. No. The whole reason we're emptying the day of work is in order that we should be able to work on the right things. In order that we should be able to rest by connecting to Hashem through davening, through learning, through farbranging, etc. So l'chaim, to always making sure that Shabbat is a day of recharging, spiritually speaking, for the entire week. L'chaim.